Good morning and welcome back to the Division of Mental Health and Addiction INARMS Symposium. Joining us this morning is our keynote speaker, Maia Szalavitz. Thank you so much to Indiana University Grand Challenges Responding to the Addictions Crisis for sponsoring our keynote. In October 2017, Indiana University President Michael A. McRobbie announced the Responding to the Addictions Crisis Grand Challenge in partnership with Governor Eric J. Holcomb, IU Health, and Eskenazi Health. This initiative is part of IU's bicentennial Grand Challenges program, which aims to marshal the university's research strengths with partners across the state to address some of the most critical issues facing Indiana and the world. The Responding to the Addictions Crisis Grand Challenges is IU's commitment to prevent and reduce substance use disorder in Indiana and beyond. Alongside community partners, we aim to combat this crisis with 30+ interdisciplinary research projects, statewide naloxone training and kit distribution, and community partnerships throughout the state. This ambitious program has three primary goals. 1, to reduce the incidence of substance use disorder. 2, to decrease the number of overdose fatalities, and 3, to reduce the number of babies born with neonatal abstinence syndrome. Leveraging the strengths of IU's 7 campuses and in partnership with 130 partner organizations, this statewide initiative is one of the nation's largest and most comprehensive state-based responses to the substance use disorder crisis, and the largest led by a university. The interdisciplinary team of researchers participating in this multifaceted effort is led by IU School of Nursing Dean Robin Newhouse. We now take a few minutes to listen and hear from Dean Newhouse in the following video.
My name is Robin Newhouse, Distinguished Professor and Dean of the Indiana University School of Nursing and Principal Investigator of Indiana University's Responding to the Addictions Crisis Grand Challenge. We are thankful to be part of the INARMS Symposium and to honor all of the people who continue to make a difference in the lives of those with substance use disorder. In partnership with the state of Indiana and 130 community organizations, we continue to provide services and support through our research to one of our country's most vulnerable populations. And we look forward to continuing to work with our policymakers, health systems, educators, and other partners in addressing this persistent crisis.
Thank you so much to Indiana University Grand Challenges Responding to the Addictions Crisis for their bronze sponsorship of the INARMS Symposium. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Maia Szalavitz. Maia is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Unbroken Brain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction. The book received the 2018 Media Award from the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the College on Problems of Drug Dependence. An earlier book, Help at Any Cost, How the Troubled Teen Industry Cons Parents and Hurts Kids, was the first to expose the damage caused by the tough love business that dominates adolescent addiction treatment and helped guide congressional hearings on the matter. She has written for numerous publications from High Times to the New York Times and is currently writing a history of harm reduction to be published in 2021. Maia, thank you so much for joining us. I turn it over to you. Oh, Maia, you are on mute. We'll send an unmute request again for Maia, and everyone will stand by for a moment of troubleshooting. On the lower bottom of your screen, when you see your video camera, there should be a unmute selection there. Everyone will just give us one moment. We will ensure that the audio is reconnected. All right, and as we wait for Maya to reconnect, and for those that's joining us, we had a slight audio issue with our keynote speaker, and she is rejoining. We will be reconnected just shortly. And for those that are just joining us, we had a short audio issue, and our keynote speaker will be joining us just shortly. And again, for those that are just joining us, we had a slight audio issue with our keynote, and she'll be back with us in just a few moments. Hi, Maya, can you hear us now?
Yes, the program crashed. It crashed my whole computer.
Oh my goodness, apologies for that.
Yeah, so it's up now. Hopefully it will stay.
Why don't we go ahead with the audio only then, so we can conserve your bandwidth. We'll go ahead and start with the first slide on screen.
Gotcha.
And why don't we just take a few seconds to get situated, and please feel free to start when you're ready.
Okay, and I think you can put the video. I don't think it was a bandwidth issue.
Okay, no worries. Then if you would like to relaunch your webcam.
How do I do that?
I've sent a request.
Okay, it is not visible.
And resending.
Can you try that again?
Yes, resending.
Okay. It should just pop up on my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, it's not doing that.
And resending one more time.
Okay. I don't know why it's doing this. It's just like a little circle.
It might be trying to identify the video cam. I think, well, let's go ahead and utilize the slide deck and audio only.
All right, so sorry about this.
No worries, no worries.
Okay, so just let me know when to start.
Okay, sounds good. And so for all of our audience members that are just now joining us, apologies for the technical difficulties. We have with us Maia Szalavitz. our keynote speaker, and Maia will be sharing with us an overview on the revolutionary new way of understanding addiction as addressed in her new book, Unbroken Brain. Maia?
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so sorry about these technical difficulties. I am honored and delighted to be here, even though I wish I could be there with you in person, and especially so during Recovery Month, and even more as this year our theme is celebrating connections. As we all know, addiction flourishes when people are divided and separate, and when we feel disconnected, unloved, and scared. Recovery, in contrast, is all about connecting and caring and being together, which is why this pandemic is especially awful for those of us who deal with addiction. Fortunately, we do have technology that sometimes helps, and we also have tools for recovery that matter even more now. For me, one day at a time comes to mind a lot. Anyway, I'd like to talk specifically today about addiction as a learning disorder and why I think that seeing it this way could transform prevention, treatment, and policy. Connection is actually essential to learning, which is something we don't think about all that often. But people learn best when they're connected to a subject emotionally and to their teacher. In fact, the most complicated and difficult thing that we ever learn, which is human language, is learned almost entirely through connection, primarily through contact with our earliest caregivers, usually our parents. Babies don't learn to speak by being punished for doing it wrong. We learn to talk because it connects us. And I want you to keep this in mind now as I turn back to addiction. Unfortunately, for many years, addiction has been misunderstood and treated as though the problem is more moral than medical. In fact, if I'd somehow nodded out in 1988, the last time I sought treatment, and I woke up in rehab today, I wouldn't see much changed. I'd see the same largely 12-step focused content. I'd see the same prejudice against medication. I'd see the same mainly law enforcement driven policy. While certainly a lot of rhetoric has changed, and some advances like the introduction of buprenorphine have occurred, the difference is surprisingly small. To move forward, we need a new perspective. And I'll begin with my own experience, which illustrates as well as anything why learning matters. For one, I'll note that speaking gigs like this were definitely not what I appeared to be heading towards back in September of 1986. I was 2 weeks into my junior year at Columbia, and I was arrested with over 1 kilo of cocaine. I had been living in Midtown Manhattan near Rockefeller Center, and I had no idea what I was about to face. I was 21 and had been addicted to coke and heroin for several years. I was living with my boyfriend, who was also my dealer. I opened the door with a needle in my arm. I had been expecting a friend. I was definitely not expecting a bunch of heavily armed undercover cops who were soon stomping around my apartment and making nasty remarks about my admittedly poor housekeeping. And so even though my parents were able to bail me out after a weekend in jail, I thought my life was basically over. I faced a 15 to life mandatory minimum under New York's harsh Rockefeller laws. So that's when I stopped shooting cocaine and heroin, right? Surely the possibility of more than a decade in prison made me wake up and seek help immediately. Surely as the police pulled me through the lobby, past the doorman and into the street, that was when I hit rock bottom. Well, no, actually not. Though I knew it was completely crazy and counterproductive, the only thing I could think of to do as soon as I was sprung from jail was more drugs. That craving for opiates completely occupied my consciousness. I couldn't think of anything else. Nothing else could make life bearable. As soon as I could get away from the relatives who'd gathered in my aunt's apartment to try to help my parents figure out what to do with me, I went back to my own apartment. I crushed and shot some illegally obtained prescription pain pills that I knew were hidden somewhere that the police had not searched. And I went on using for another 2 years at constant risk of being caught again. I felt like I couldn't stop. I couldn't even imagine life without drugs. Now, I'm not telling this story because I'm proud of it, of course. At this point, it's actually extremely embarrassing, and it does make me cringe just to think about a lot of it. However, I'm mentioning it now and here because it precisely reflects the utter disconnect between what we think will stop addiction and what actually does. In America, we call being kind to people with addiction enabling them. We see loving them as the disease of codependence. Only tough love, we believe, will help. Or as one drug court official put it succinctly, force is the best medicine for addicts. But actually, we've got it completely backwards. Think about psychiatry's definition of addiction, or as it is now called in the DSM, substance use disorder, moderate to severe. What all that text there boils down to, in a simple phrase, is compulsive drug use that continues despite negative consequences. Indeed, here's the National Institute on Drug Abuse summarizing it using almost exactly the same wording. It's a disease characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences. In essence, you keep using even when you get suspended from school, arrested, incarcerated, cut out by friends and family. You keep using even when you personally desperately want to stop. You keep on even if you lose your job, your children, your home, everything you own, and everyone you love. To be addicted, by definition, you have to persist despite punishment. Indeed, negative consequences is basically a synonym for punishment, right? So think about what that means. Basically, if punishments like incarceration and social rejection could stop the compulsion of addiction, the problem that we face here every day, by definition, wouldn't exist. Nonetheless, we've spent more than a century blindly punishing people for having a condition which is defined by its resistance to punishment. As I see it, and this is far from original, the science has shown this for decades, addiction is actually a learning disorder. Now, I want to talk more about why I think this. First, as we've known from Skinner and Pavlov onwards, punishment is involved in some kinds of learning. If you take a rat like this and put them in a cage and shock them, the next time you try to put them in that cage, they're really not going to want to go there, right? But if you first given them some Coke in that cage, or an opposite sex rat, or some heroin, the rat might persist despite a shock in order to get the drugs. And if it's willing to do that despite increasingly intense punishments, it's pretty fair to say that this is a good model of addiction. And that is a learning disorder. Basically, addiction is a disorder, that changes a certain type of learning during development, and it cannot occur in the absence of learning. Again, think about it. Without learning to associate pleasure and relief with a drug, you wouldn't even know what to crave, so you couldn't be addicted to it. Indeed, a condition that involves failure to learn from experience to avoid punishment is, again, pretty much by definition, a learning problem, right? So, like other learning disorders, for example, ADHD or dyslexia, addiction characteristically starts at a particular period during development, in this case, adolescence and young adulthood. Unlike most of these disorders, addiction affects a very specific form of learning and a specific set of brain circuits, not general intelligence. In fact, many of these conditions are even accompanied by some advantages. ADHD, for example, is linked with entrepreneurial talent, while dyslexia improves skills in pattern finding. With addiction, the same appears to be true. In many areas of life, in fact, persisting despite negative experience is actually the key to success. Unfortunately, while neuroscientists and other addiction researchers have long accepted this, it's not at all what has been emphasized when the condition is described as a brain disorder. Instead, we hear talk of addiction as a chronic progressive disease in which drugs hijack the brain. We hear that addiction is a brain disease because drugs change the brain. We hear about people who can no longer make their own choices because the idea of having a hijacked brain implies that they no longer have any responsibility for their own behavior. But this doesn't capture the full essence of either the lived experience of being addicted or the behavior that people see from the outside. Addicted people don't really act like zombies. We might sometimes look like them, but instead we appear more like we're finding clever ways to be able to do exactly what we want to do. We seem aligned with our desires, not alienated from them. So I want to argue, in contrast to the hijacked brain view, that addiction's resistance to punishment is fundamental to the condition. I want to argue that the problem is not brain damage, but a form of overlearning that occurs in a very specific brain system. To be precise, addiction is misguided learning in the brain networks that evolved to support the fundamentals of mammalian life: feeding, mating, and parenting. To survive and to reproduce, it's often necessary to persist despite obstacles. No one, at least no one I've ever known, could manage either as a partner or as a parent without doing this. But when the system that evolved to drive that persistence gets misdirected towards a drug, it can set priorities in ways that become pathological. And that, in essence, is addiction. It skews our choices. It doesn't eliminate them. Ignoring this, however, for many decades, we've incarcerated users, busted dealers, harshly treated people with addiction in treatment and outside of it, and feebly attempted to stop one of the most irrepressible forces in the world, aka the free market. The result, as I'm sure you all know, has been a cycle of repeated drug epidemics, the spread of infectious disease like HIV, mass incarceration of minorities, and no sustained progress in reducing either overall drug use, addiction, or drug-related harm. The problem is you can't effectively change what you don't understand, and we truly don't understand addiction. We see it as a Janus-headed beast. One faces sin, the other faces disease. We don't recognize how learning affects it. Instead, we alternate between seeing each of its countenances. From one perspective, we frame the addiction person as a sinner. From the other, we see the cause of the compulsion as a disease. Unfortunately, neither position is entirely accurate, which is why we never make up our mind and kind of flip back and forth without real resolution. We say addiction is a disease, but then we offer treatment that involves prayer and confession. We say it's a sin and a crime, but then some people get very plush medical rehab. And either perspective that we take, our policy choices have historically involved criminalization and stigmatizing people, even though we don't treat anything else that we call a medical disease this way. Until we understand how both the medical view and the moral view combine to create the current impasse, we can't recognize addiction as it is and help more people to get better. So let's start with the moral view. People who take this perspective argue that addiction is plain old bad behavior, and so people need to hit bottom or be forced into compliance via criminal penalties to push them down to bottom. Only then will they be willing to do the hard work of recovery and restitution. No, it's a brain disease, says the other side. This group wants to see addiction as a medical problem, and I absolutely 100% agree with that point. Disease model supporters argue, why would rational people continue to seek a high that they will readily admit has faded? Why would they keep using despite profoundly distressing experiences like being fired, getting sick, losing friends, etc., etc.? Who would choose a life like that? Their brain must be hijacked. Both sides, unfortunately, don't usually see the whole picture. And as a result, strategies for dealing with it are a sort of mixed up mess, a sort of medico-moral model. Those who see sin fail to recognize the way addiction genuinely does narrow choice. They think people with addiction are just free to stop at any time. On the other hand, those who see disease often miss how addiction isn't simply automatism, and that people with addiction are constantly making real choices. Learning helps us get past this false dichotomy because it is what shapes and guides how we make decisions, and that is the main problem in addiction. Essentially, addiction is what happens when your brain falls in love with a drug or an activity rather than a person. The weird but goal-driven behavior that looks like totally free choice is exactly the same kind of thing we see in obsessed lovers, where people do all sorts of irrational things to ensure that they can be together. Think about Romeo and Juliet. They risk everything for each other, including their families, obviously, who are at war. Romeo kills two guys, Juliet takes poison, and each of them chooses death when they learn that they can't be together. Or far more prosaically, we have Mark Sanford, the former South Carolina governor, who outlandishly claimed that he was hiking the Appalachian Trail, but he was really in Argentina with his mistress. Finally, consider how besotted lovers act in more ordinary circumstances. Even our name for them suggests a link to drunkenness. They'll obsess for hours over their beloved. They'll spend far more money than they should. They'll go great distances, drop their friends, change their interests, indeed rearrange their entire lives. And all of the yearning and craving described in love songs exactly parallels the addicted person's relationship with drugs. And similarly, the hiding, plotting, lying, and other misbehavior seen during illicit affairs can also be seen during some illicit drug addiction. While lovers certainly do make free choices, love alters our perception of what matters in ways that profoundly affect our decisions. And the same is true in addiction. Addiction is a form of learning that occurs in a system that evolved to get us through the tough times and obstacles that are inevitable in love and parenting. But when that system learns to direct its behavior towards drugs, it all goes awry. Learning explains why all addiction is not the same and why one-size-fits-all treatment can't possibly work. It explains why, like every other psychiatric diagnosis, addiction is wildly varied and very hard to pin down. Everyone's psychological and neurodevelopment is different, even if you're an identical twin. However, we haven't incorporated this uniqueness into the way we cope with addictions. Instead, we think of addiction as being, and people with addiction as being a certain type, as having an addictive personality marked by selfishness, ugliness, and dishonesty. We see them as all the same, all just as likely to lie, steal, cheat, or become violent. Science, however, has never been able to detect a single addictive personality that's common to everyone with addiction. Studies just don't find it. And that's because a unique addictive personality doesn't exist. While some traits, like being fearless and seeking thrills, are elevated in some people with addiction, the exact opposite traits, like being anxious and terrified of change, are high in others. Someone like this who risks everything and enjoys these kinds of thrills, not like me, right, is very different from a woman with anxiety and depression. And neither has exactly the same personality characteristics as a cold, remorseless con artist. It turns out that many different types of traits can raise addiction risk, but not everyone with addiction has all of them, and some have few or even none. And the worst traits, the ones that the public sees as common to everyone with addiction, like being violent, deceitful, callous, and self-centered, are not actually inherent to addiction itself. About 14 to 18% of people with addiction do have a personality disorder that is linked with mendacious, uncaring, and manipulative behavior. That's known as antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD. And that rate is indeed higher than in the general population. It's about 4 times higher. However, that still means that 82% of us should not be stereotyped that way. Addiction is far more varied. We aren't all sociopaths, but nor are we all shy, retiring, depressed folks. Like everyone else, we're complicated. For me, I can trace my addiction back to my temperament, to my earliest experiences of finding the world overwhelming and my senses too intense. Lights were too bright, sounds were too loud, even smells, textures, and tastes were often terrifying. People were the most frightening of all, though. I didn't understand the logic of social contact, and I didn't like to be touched unless I could feel and control. So in order to cope, I developed rigid routines and passionate intellectual interests where I could escape, starting with reading, which I learned when I was 3. Now that, of course, soon made my parents and teachers see me as unusually smart, but I came to believe that I was fundamentally a bad person. Good people preferred socializing. I preferred ideas. Good people took turns. I dominated conversations. Good people weren't bossy or selfish, but I needed to control my environment to deal with my sensory overload and hide the compulsive repetitive behavior I used to manage it. I soon decided that the only way I would ever be able to have any friends was to become rich and famous so that everyone would at least pretend to like me. You can imagine what it was like to live with that level of self-hatred and how attractive that would make any type of anesthesia. By the time I was in my teens, I was crazed from being bullied, excluded, and lonely. And I eventually discovered that drugs were a passionate interest that people actually did want to hear me go on and on about, unlike opera or science fiction. If you're familiar with Asperger syndrome, which is a form of autism and a developmental disorder, my childhood retrospectively sounds like a classic case. But the diagnosis didn't exist at the time, and the ones that I ultimately received, ADHD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, heroin dependence, cocaine dependence, depression, even bipolar, did not really capture the scope of my experience. Indeed, it was not until I understood that I had a developmental disorder that I began to understand addiction. And yeah, my path from reading at 3 to shooting up at 20 was unusual. However, after interviewing hundreds of people with addiction, I learned so is everyone else's. There's a saying that's common in the autism community, and that's if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. But that's just as true for addiction. Now, of course, there are some common factors, and not surprisingly, I'm going to argue that most of them are related to learning and development. One of the most important, which hints at why development matters so much, is timing. 90% of all addictions start during the teens and early 20s. It's no coincidence that we worry most about adolescence when it comes to drugs. Because addiction vulnerability depends on stages of brain growth, it's far more common in youth than in any other time. And that's because adolescence and young adulthood involve a specific set of brain changes and a specific developmental challenge. In humans, there are 3 periods of intense brain development: the prenatal period, infancy, and adolescence. Developmental disorders tend to cluster at these times. The symptoms of autism and ADHD, for example, appear in early childhood, while schizophrenia symptoms don't tend to appear until late adolescence or early adulthood. In fact, 75% of all mental illness starts before age 24, and quite typically during adolescence. The brain is developmentally sensitive during each of these periods. So let's talk specifically about what's going on during adolescence. Basically, the regions that motivate reproduction and create pleasure and desire grow stronger. But unfortunately, this happens long before the areas that mediate restraint and judgment do, as anyone who's ever been or met a teenager might be able to tell you. During the teen years too, most people learn how to cope with the kinds of emotional challenges that they're going to face in their adult life, particularly those involving peer and romantic relationships. Before adolescence, people rarely experience romantic love, and the same is actually true for addiction. And that's not a coincidence. It's down to the brain development of these reproductive systems. Moreover, if teens learn to rely exclusively on drugs to cope with the challenges of socializing and sex, this can interfere not only with brain development, but also with the development of psychological tactics for emotion regulation and for relationship maintenance. And that's why, if you haven't developed an addiction by your 30s, your odds of doing so are less than 1%, even if you get exposed to highly addictive drugs like opioids. Once you pass 25 or so, your brain has completed its construction of the regions involved in self-control. And you've typically also developed ways to cope, so drug exposure is less risky. Not risk-free, of course, but less dangerous. Nearly all types of learning get harder as you get older, unfortunately. But the good news is that the learning that's involved in addiction is probably also one of those things that gets harder. Another commonality among people with addiction, sadly, is trauma. Some people come to addiction because their childhoods are a litany of horrors: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, parental loss, bullying, neglect. The list is endless. And the greater the distress and suffering, and the higher the number of different types of traumatic experience, the greater the addiction risk, studies show. Even just one severe adversity, like losing a parent or witnessing domestic violence, before age 15, doubles the odds of substance abuse disorder, according to a study that included the entire Swedish population. And of course, many people with addiction have both trauma and developmental differences. In fact, the experience of trauma is often what distinguishes between people who have a genetic or temperamental predisposition to something and those who actually develop the disorder. While some people with addiction are oversensitive and seeking calm, others are insensitive and seeking stimulation, and some actually swing back and forth. But nearly all have some type of difficulty regulating their emotions and/or their response to sensory experience, although the reasons for this and the exact problems vary. Seeing addiction as a learning disorder helps explain this variety. People with different perspectives, with different genes, in different environments, at different times in life, in different cultures, are going to learn different things, and that's going to affect how a learning disorder will develop. But the learning model has even bigger implications than that. For one, it means that the drug problem doesn't lie only in the drug. In fact, only 10 to 20% of people who try even the most demonized drugs like heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine actually become addicted. Think about that. Most people who take the most addictive drugs do not get hooked. Now, I'm definitely not saying you should run out and try them. Simply that most people, fortunately, don't develop addictions. Something beyond exposure is necessary. Indeed, trying the drug isn't the only thing that traps them. Instead, people get hooked by a mix of factors, including their current situation, their predispositions, and the way that they learn that drugs are useful for coping. Exposure can't cause addiction by itself. The disorder requires for a person to repeatedly choose to take the drug, learn that it's useful for coping, and then continue when it becomes harmful. Incidentally, this is why babies cannot be born addicted, contrary to claims you often see in the media. While infants can certainly be born with physical dependence, and that can sometimes lead to horrible withdrawal symptoms, the infant doesn't know what to want in order to make himself better. They don't know if they need a diaper change or mommy or heroin. And even if they did know what to crave, they couldn't go out and get the drug and use it despite negative consequences. It's kind of hard to score drugs when you can't walk and you can't talk and you have no money, right? Further, this is also why physical dependence, physically needing something to function, whether it's buprenorphine or blood pressure medication, is not addiction. Dependence is a normal physiological response to some drugs. Addiction is compulsive behavior that continues despite harm. And so if needing a medication to function isn't causing harm, by definition, that's not addiction. I could be dependent on Prozac to avoid a relapse of my depression, but I'm not sitting around craving my next dose, writing odes to the joy of Prozac, or robbing a drugstore so I can have some extra. The drug is helping me, not harming. And the same would be true if the drug I needed was methadone or buprenorphine. Maintenance use of medication can include physical dependence, but it doesn't mean that people are still addicted. If a drug, whether it's insulin, medication for high blood pressure, or yes, methadone or buprenorphine, makes your life genuinely better and the benefits outweigh the risks, that is not addiction. And it's certainly true for these medications. When someone is stabilized on an appropriate regular dose, they are not impaired, and the drug allows them to work, drive, love, parent, whatever, just like anybody else. It's also important to note in the context of the overdose crisis that the only two treatments that we have that are proven to cut the death rate by 50% or more are long-term, possibly lifelong use of either buprenorphine or methadone. When we think about families affected by opioid addiction, we need to prioritize these life-saving medications rather than stigmatizing them and telling people that real recovery involves total abstinence and going away to rehab. What matters in recovery is getting your life back, not what substances are in your blood or in your brain. Now, I want to return for a moment to a critical moment in addiction, the time when someone is first exposed to the drug. Usually in addiction stories, including mine, you'll hear about how this experience was ecstatic, or it felt like being home and warm, safe and loved and perfect for the first time ever, perhaps. But even a wonderful first time taking drugs doesn't by itself create addiction. When people find a drug that seems like heaven, in fact, most do not immediately decide to repeat it. Instead, they say to themselves, wow, that was so great, I better not mess with that stuff. They think to themselves that they're the only people who have this experience because these stories are not told very often. Indeed, such a memoir, I tried it, I loved it, and I stopped, would be boring and not exactly bestseller material. But people who have these experiences are actually in the majority. They might get the same euphoria as people who take these drugs, but their response is not, this is the answer to all my problems. Instead, it's a healthy, this is dangerous and I don't want to ruin my life. If your life is in ruins already, however, the odds of the let's go for it response are far greater. And this can be seen even in animal research, as in the famous rat park studies of the 1980s, which basically compared rats in a stimulating social environment filled with other rats and toys and all kinds of things that rats love, to those that were held in basically solitary confinement. One of the experiments found that the rats kept in solitary will take 19 times more morphine than those that are living in a more stimulating social world. And later research also found that if you give mice access to running wheels, cocaine and heroin is less attractive to them. And if you give monogamous male prairie voles amphetamine, they're not exactly interested in it. But if they're single males, they actually really quite like it. Basically, if you have friends, a partner, and productive ways to spend your time, not surprisingly, you're going to be less interested in seeking escape with chemicals. Addiction occurs in a specific context then. If you are in an empty cage with no hope, and I had to get a cat picture in here, it's far more likely than if you have strong relationships and a sense of purpose. And this is also why liberation from addiction requires far more than just taking away the drug. Here too, learning matters. Both love and addiction need to be learned. And when love is misdirected towards a drug or an inappropriate person, they need to be unlearned. And so once we understand the role of learning in addiction, we can devise better ways of dealing with it. For one, since addiction is really love gone awry, it's not a brain disease in the sense that cells are necessarily permanently damaged. Now that can certainly happen in some severe cases, but it's neither necessary nor sufficient to cause addiction. Just think about gambling addiction, which occurs without any outside chemical help. Gamblers behave just as irrationally as other people with addiction, and they lose just as much to it, sometimes more. But if addiction were caused by drugs changing the brain, how could gambling addiction exist? Instead, in all types of addiction, your brain has just learned to love the wrong thing. And the good news is this doesn't mean your brain is permanently damaged. Love doesn't break your brain or mean that you are irreparably dysfunctional. Yes, addictive learning deeply embeds associations and cravings, but the same is true of any significant love affair. Just think about what happens when you hear that song, or you come across an old love photo on Facebook, or a memento that was meant to be hidden away. Critically, however, just as most of us can get over bad relationships, most people can also get over addictions. In fact, research shows that substance use disorders actually have one of the best recovery rates of all DSM diagnoses, not as many believe some of the worst. Epidemiological studies of large samples repeatedly find that most people who meet DSM criteria for severe substance use disorder do overcome it, and most actually do so without formal treatment or even self-help groups. Half of all addictions, it turns out, excluding tobacco, end by the early to mid-30s. And the reason we see it differently is because we typically only study people with addiction who wind up in treatment. And of course, people who quit on their own don't tend to show up in treatment, because why would they? The skewed treatment sample that tends to be studied gives us a much more pessimistic view of the disorder than is truly the case. And it also deprives us of lessons we might learn from people who do stop without help. So when we recognize the role of learning in addiction, many other aspects of policy also become clear. As noted earlier, punishment and shame won't stop it. They'll make it worse, in fact. And trying to stop addiction by banning one substance will just shift that behavior elsewhere. It's like trying to stop obsessive compulsive hand washing by banning one brand of soap, and then another brand, and then another, and then banning hand sanitizer, right? So with this perspective, we can start to address addiction far more effectively. We can stop blindly cracking down on supply and simply pushing people from one drug to a different and often more harmful substitute. We can stop using punitive tactics that worsen mental illness and re-traumatize child abuse survivors, and start developing approaches that actually work, applying principles that facilitate human learning in general. We can stop stigmatizing medication treatment that works, and we can help people find care that's appropriate to their own unique needs in the community. Now, this perspective also sheds light on another important response to the overdose crisis, which is known as harm reduction. Consider needle exchanges, which I know you guys have had some experience with recently, at least. They provide clean syringes to people who inject drugs and are not ready, willing, or able to get off yet. For decades, the federal government banned funding of syringe exchange based on the idea that it would only encourage further drug use. And besides, addicted people couldn't learn to protect themselves while they were still using. They were impaired, no learning could happen. They couldn't control anything in their lives unless they quit first, or they just wouldn't care. The data has long shown that this is false. In fact, people who participate in needle exchange are more likely to get treatment, not less. Unlike many traditional methods of dealing with addiction, however, needle exchanges work by attracting customers, not coercing them. No one forces anyone to show up. They come because they want to protect themselves, and yes, because clean needles make injecting less painful and more effective. But when they arrive, they get much more than clean works. When I went out on the street with needle exchange pioneer John Parker and ACT UP members in the 90s, dozens of people would show up as if from nowhere. We'd show up on the Lower East Side or in one of the Bronx or Brooklyn's most desolate, crime-ridden areas. Almost immediately, we'd be surrounded. Everyone is eager, of course, to get clean needles and let the activists dispose of their old used ones. But no one was violent or threatening. There was little or no pushing or shoving. In fact, the often hardened street people were typically exquisitely polite, fiercely protective of the needle exchangers, and happy to wait their turn in peace. At first, I noticed the similarities, like visible and sometimes even bloody track marks on arms, hands, legs, and even necks. I'd see the unhealthy gray-green complexions and the distant eyes that seemed to be tuned into another world. But soon, though, I began to focus on individual people. There was actually an incredible spectrum of people seeking clean works, from white, Asian, Hispanic, African American, everything in between. And when I began to look more closely, I noticed something really powerful. When these extremely marginalized and often homeless folks were treated with respect, their whole posture seemed to change. The defensive street mask of indifference that most of them wore to ward off humiliation would lift and be replaced with a genuine smile, even if only briefly. Many seemed that they couldn't believe that anyone could care, or that anyone could offer help without demanding abstinence or some sort of immediate obedience. They were just shocked by people being kind to them. And paradoxically, by making them feel less shame and more self-worth, this enabled them to not want to take more drugs, but to reconsider that behavior. After all, if I'm not totally worthless, if someone sees something enough in me to risk arrest to help me, maybe I do have something to give. Maybe spending all my time injecting and seeking drugs isn't the only thing I'm good for. Maybe I might have a chance, and maybe I could even help other people like me. Indeed, from these brief, promising moments of human connection, research showed that all types of health improvement, including recovery, could spring. These programs aren't enabling people to avoid hitting bottom. That's a concept that fails to recognize that addiction is actually a failure to respond to negative experiences. Instead, what's going on is that they are empowering people by offering hope. And far from encouraging drug use, harm reduction programs like syringe exchange help get people into recovery, in some cases ultimately referring 2/3 of all visitors. Treating people well basically helps them treat themselves better. In fact, it's the sense that change is possible that drives all kinds of learning, and that's what we need to give people with addiction. Being a student, after all, is a much more hopeful role than being a patient. And seeing your customers as learners in need of an education rather than sinners who need redemption creates a very different power relationship. Seeing addiction as a learning disorder, moreover, doesn't tell people that they're permanently damaged and can't change. Instead, it suggests that they have a different form of brain wiring that can be disabling if not properly managed, but that doesn't have to be that way. We've recognized that positive motivation works better in other types of learning. For example, there are no academically excellent schools that beat kids. Now we need to bring the research on the psychology of learning to bear similarly on addiction. And overwhelmingly, it shows that people learn best when they feel connected, included, and comfortable enough to be vulnerable. And this is not, unfortunately, how we've typically tried to help people with addiction. Moreover, as with other types of neurodiversity, like autism, addictive wiring can sometimes bring advantages, not just disability. After all, if you put that persistence despite obstacles that marks addiction in service of a career or your family, it can be really useful. And if you put things like sensory differences to good use, they may help with creativity, empathy, and all kinds of other things. For me, I learned addiction because my temperament predisposed me to seek ways of managing the intensity of my experience. I learned it because I couldn't find any other way into socializing. But I learned recovery when I recognized that my addiction was harming more than helping. I was able to let it go when I realized I wasn't bad, but had a disorder that I tried, however ineffectually, to self-medicate. My last day injecting drugs 2 years after that arrest, I found myself out of money and begging a man I didn't like for heroin. Before that, I hadn't considered doing anything that made me feel morally uncomfortable in order to get drugs. I didn't think dealing was wrong because I didn't think using was wrong. In that moment, however, even though both my boyfriend and his girlfriend were in the same room, I considered trying to seduce the guy with the drugs. And though I don't judge other people who do exchange sex for drugs, I knew that it would be devastating for me. After all, it had taken me a long time to get comfortable with having people touch me when I wanted them to, not let alone when I didn't. And I knew in that moment that I needed to change. It was not my most desperate moment, nor my rock bottom. I'd had far worse experiences like being arrested. And it was not hopelessness that motivated me. I'd had more hopeless experiences like having to drop out of Columbia. It was insight, followed fortunately by the opportunity to get help, which I asked for and was able to pay for via my parents' insurance. I stopped when I realized, or basically learned, that I was addicted. At that point, I knew I had to try something different, and I entered rehab the next day. That was August 4th, 1988. What ultimately turned me around was learning new ways to cope, not being shamed or attacked or broken down further. What helped was the support of other people, often people who'd been there, but not always. And also what eventually worked was antidepressant medications, which help relieve my sensory and emotional overload even now. What works for me isn't necessarily what's going to help everyone, as you can probably guess I would say by now. Because addiction is learned, there are probably just as many different ways out of it as there are into it. But once we recognize the true nature of addiction, we can get much better at dealing with it. In terms of prevention, we can help kids who are traumatized or have difficult or otherwise outlying temperaments to learn better ways of coping, long before their pain or the maladaptive coping becomes big enough to cause problems. For treatment, we can use the rich psychological literature on how to enhance learning in general to teach people to find new ways to cope and to find new sources of safety, joy, and comfort. We can expand beyond 12-step programs, recognizing that they work for some, but not imposing them on all, and centering treatment on techniques like cognitive behavioral or motivational enhancement therapy that you can't get for free in a church basement. As for overall policy, we know that the current punitive approach is a failure, and that if we want to reduce drug-related harm, we need to stop stigmatizing and criminalizing users and start offering attractive alternatives that offer hope, not more of the same. Addiction thrives on shame, stigma, and self-loathing. It grows in fear, pain, alienation, and despair. To address it, we need to stop arguing about whether it's a sin or a progressive brain-damaging disease. If you want to say it's a disease, let's say it's a disease that takes the form of a learning disorder, not one that inevitably gets worse. That not only more accurately describes the condition, but it also provides a more hopeful and less stigmatizing perspective. And if you want to say that it's a health problem, disease or disorder, you have to treat it like other conditions with evidence-based therapy, including medication when needed and not punishment. To spur recovery, we need to teach hope and stop compulsively using failed strategies despite negative outcomes. We've blamed people with addiction for being unwilling to change when their coping methods stop working, but we've done exactly the same thing as a society in terms of drug policy. By recognizing addiction as a learning disorder, we can stop persisting in policies that cause harm and instead learn to use compassion, curiosity, connection, and community to teach recovery. Thank you very much.
Maya, thank you so much for your powerful testimonial and your revolutionary ways of relooking at prevention, treatment, and recovery. I welcome the audience to submit their questions in the question pane, and we have a few already to get us started. Maya, one of the attendees writes, thank you for identifying the connection between prenatal brain development, infant brain development, and adolescent brain development as stages of brain growth when addiction vulnerability is highest. What are your recommendations for prevention care during these stages, and specifically pre-adolescent and adolescent?
Right. Well, basically, a lot of our prevention focuses on kind of telling kids that drugs are bad. What we actually need to do is find kids who are outliers, the kids who are ADHD or seem depressed or seem anxious or seem incredibly bold, and help them find ways of managing the things that are going to get them in trouble otherwise without drugs. If we can teach people coping skills, like if you have a kid that's a little anxious when they're preteen, let's say, if they get good coping skills to deal with their anxiety, even if they drink, which, you know, kids are probably going to experiment, but they're much less likely to become addicted if they just experiment, if they have the coping skills already on board. So we need to really focus on, you know, 50% of all people with addiction have another pre-existing mental illness, including ADHD and autism. So we need to focus on why those things would make you want to take drugs and then help you avoid that. Now, the other thing that people with addiction tend to have is early life trauma. And again, for that, before it develops into something like PTSD or depression or any of the other things that can worsen, we need to help kids have ways of dealing with that and help them have healthy ways to have fun.
Thank you, Maya, for those insights. I think it's incredibly important for us to look at it from a individual child perspective while also looking at more broader global policies to support prevention on a pre-adolescent and adolescent scale. Thank you for those insights.
Sure. Do you want to try to put the video back on?
I'll be happy to. Let's do a webcam request and let's see if that works.
Oh, I guess it's still not working. Oh well, anyway, I feel bad.
Well, hopefully it will be able to load and showcase. But as
Oh,
we
wait, I got it. It has come through.
Oh, fantastic. And we do see you now.
Great. Hi.
For our audience, this is Maia Szalavitz, our lovely keynote speaker. And we'll move on to the second question. You provided an interesting study on Rat Park, social environment versus solitary confinement that attributes to riskier decisions. Do you believe COVID-19 spatial and social distancing has increased societal vulnerability to addiction?
Absolutely. We're already hearing about people in recovery relapsing, about people overdosing, just people who even don't have addictions, just drinking more, smoking more, eating more. We're all highly stressed, and a lot of what addiction is a method of coping with stress, however harmful. So yeah, the social environment matters enormously. There are some people who have the statement that the opposite of addiction is not recovery, it's connection. And I think that's a really good way of putting it. We are ineluctably social creatures. We are interdependent. We are not independent. We cannot live without each other. And what relieves human stress is social contact. And when you have to reduce that or make it so that you can't touch each other, then you end up with a lot of unrelieved stress, and people start seeking problematic behaviors to try to deal with that. So, and this is also likely going to be traumatic for children because of the virtual school and the less opportunities for socializing. And I mean, we're all having, I think everybody's kind of going out in the world again and being a little weird because we haven't talked to people, So I think this is a huge issue, and I think we have to prepare for it. And I think, virtual stuff can help, but it is just not as good as actually being able to be there and give someone a hug.
Very apt recommendations to essentially spend just a little bit more time with our children as they are going through this time, and also making sure to take the self-care as well. And question 3 from our attendees: the state of Indiana has invested heavily in trauma-informed care to support provider response and to develop recovery-oriented systems of care in our communities. What additional models in trauma prevention should we be looking at from a state policy level?
So I think it's really important to, if a mom with addiction has a baby, if we can keep them together as much as possible, that is going to reduce at least one trauma, the trauma of separation and having to deal with a whole new family. So keeping kids together and keeping families together, obviously when it's possible. But there's some research, I believe, out of Harvard, where they have a program, I guess it's at Mass General, where they work with babies with neonatal abstinence syndrome and their moms, and they can keep something like 90% of them together. So there really are models for being able to do that, and that at least reduces one adverse childhood experience that kid does not have to have. The other thing I want to say is that a lot of trauma is the experience of being powerless in a situation you can't control, which of course we're all kind of in that situation right now, right? But the recognition of that in creating settings like schools and therapy and everything like that, the more control you can give to the patient, the more control you can give to the child, the more that person feels empowered to make decisions in their life, the better it's going to work for people who are traumatized. I know for a long time, you see the kid looking around and he's not paying attention, and you think like, oh, he has ADHD, or oh, he's just like bored. But sometimes that kid's traumatized, and what he's paying attention for is somebody going to hit me from the back, right? So we need to be sensitive to these things. And the other thing I want to mention about trauma-informed care is things like music, movement, dance, drumming, arts. All of these kinds of things are really good for helping traumatized kids get in touch with their body again, and also have empathy and connection. So I know people, the first thing to get cut is always the arts, and it's terrible, but we really, if we actually want to prevent addiction and we want to prevent people from having the sequelae of trauma, we need to provide these enriched environments.
A fantastic whole person approach, whole child education focus. We have multiple attendees that are representative of the law enforcement and criminal justice fields. How can we, one, collaborate further policy-wise, and then two, what do you see the role for police, probation, and other law enforcement officers?
Well, ideally, we should let the cops be cops and let the social workers be social workers. And what I mean by that is that, and let the doctors be doctors. So if addiction's a medical problem, we should turn that over to people with medical and psychological skills. And I do think that the role for law enforcement should be to enforce laws related to people harming other people. Where that's going on, you are likely going to need a police officer. And that is the role. Some of the people that are going to be caught up in that, however, are going to be people with addiction. And then within the criminal justice system, we need evidence-based care, particularly, medication treatment. If we don't provide the same standard of care outside as inside if we do outside, we're going, we know that the risk for somebody coming out of jail or prison for overdose is like 200 or 300 times. It's a hugely increased risk. If we can get them onto methadone or Suboxone while they're in prison, that would be enormous. And for those who prefer naltrexone, they should be on that. But give people some support to avoid that extremely high risk period, and also give them support during that period in general, because people need housing and people need treatment and all kinds of other things that we don't do a very good job of connecting people up with. So I think law enforcement can do a really good job of connecting people to things, but the sort of you must do this or that is not a technique that is helpful for resolving addiction, because again, you're talking about a lot of really traumatized people, and until they can get a sense of control and a sense of choice, they are not going to respond well to punishment. So the ways in which I think referrals and other situations where you say, okay, this person has like a medical problem, I'm going to get them to a doctor. Or this person's overdosing, I'm carrying naloxone, I'm going to save them. I think what's also really important is, people, sometimes I think law enforcement sees people at their worst, and it's a really good idea to have people in recovery, let them see that there's another side to that, and that you are, it seems hopeless if you're seeing the same people over and over again, but people do get better, and there are ways to help them get better. And becoming educated and being compassionate in those situations is, I think, the best that can be done.
Thank you for that comprehensive strategy on how multiple different roles can approach our recovery communities with more empathy and more educated response. We have a directed, now moving into individual questions from the attendees versus kind of broad-based grouping. One, we have a representative from the Indiana Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program that asks, similar to conceptualizing addiction as a learning disorder, do you think it is appropriate to look at addiction as a disruption in attachment?
Yes, that is another way of looking at it. And I mean, I think this is one of the things that is a huge problem in the addictions field in general. We all want it to be one thing, and it isn't really one thing. It's a complex mixture of things. For many people, attachment issues are going to be huge. And since attachment and learning are so wrapped up in each other, you can have the learning disorder idea encompass that. But it's certainly the case, and this is why why I said that thing about, if you've met one person with this, you've met one person with this. In the addictions field, we've had this terrible notion that all people with addiction are the same. Like if I stood up and said, I can speak for all white, red-haired women, people would think I'm nuts. But if I say, I'm Maya and I'm speaking for all people with addiction, you will believe me. And that's not right. People with addiction are hugely, hugely varied. And yes, attachment is a key issue for many, but it may not be for some. So you have to be looking at what that individual in front of you, what their needs are. And if they are that, definitely work with that.
Thank you so much to Eric Wood for posing that wonderful question. Additionally, when we look at talking about youth opportunities, can you speak to the program Preventure as a tool for youth?
Yes, I have written about Preventure, and it has a very unique structure, which is they do, I don't know how familiar people there are with it, but what the idea is, in the beginning of the school year, kids take a personality test that's like completely detached from anything else. And then 6 months later, some of them are invited into a special class, which, unbeknownst to the kids, is actually targeted at some of these outlying personalities. So if there's anxious kids, depressed kids, impulsive, so they have these different groupings, but they're not labeling the kids with that. They're not telling them why they're in these groups, but they are offering these groups that do have those kids with those issues ways of coping with that. And the seminars are billed as a, this is a way to get you to be more successful with the personality that you have, kind of thing. So it's not coming from a place of pathology, it's coming from a place of growth. We need more studies. We need to figure out if all of those classifications are, working right. And I think it needs a trauma piece. But I think that's the kind of thing we should be looking at, because if you can, we know how developmental these disorders are. I just remember myself, like when I was a kid, I was getting into these habits of thought that, built my brain, and that built my brain to be very anxious and compulsive. And if that had stopped earlier, it would have been a lot easier to stop it, because, when you're learning anything, you need to avoid bad habits early, because unlearning is harder than learning, right? So I think that these kinds of programs that, meet the kids where they are and look at their specific issues are going to be very helpful. But we also want to avoid the problem of like labeling kids as problem kids.
Certainly a phenomenal methodology and program that really should be looked at in detail as we have more of our schools coming full force back into the school facilities. So many wonderful questions coming in. Please do continue to type them into the question pane. Give everyone a few seconds to finish typing. And during that time, Maya, could you share, as we've had several questions on this, on where to purchase your book?
Oh, sure. You could get it at Amazon or Barnes & Noble or your independent bookstore. It should be readily available. If you want to go to my website, which is mayasz.com, there are links on there. But yes, I hope you will do that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maya. We have a representative from Drug Free Partnership with a question on decriminalization will be a huge undertaking across many professions, but greatly needed for effective substance use disorder and addiction recovery. Incarceration has proven very ineffective in resolving this national health crisis. Do you know of any current models or committees working on a decriminalization program, and where can we go for such resources?
Yes, there is a Western state, and I'm going to confuse whether it's Oregon or Washington, but I can find this if you connect me with this person, I can find it for them. But yes, they're actually, it's on the ballot this year. So I believe it's the Drug Policy Alliance that are working with that state to pass this initiative and to make it work. And there have been sort of steps towards that previously, like in the 90s, Arizona had one where it's like trying to do 3 chances at treatment before you get prison, and California has had similar things like this. Now, this is obviously going even further, which I think is a good idea, but yes, there are logistics and issues and ways of dealing with it. So if you hook us up afterwards, I can get you which state that is. I'm sorry, I cannot recall which one.
Well, thank you, Maya. We certainly will be following up with you on that resource, and we'll be happy to post it along with your video and also your handout and references. For those that have asked for a copy of Maya's PowerPoint, it is actually in the GoToWebinar. If you select handouts, you can download both the references and resources that she's used today, along with her PowerPoint. Justin Phillips, the Executive Director of Overdose Lifeline, has also commented in that if individuals are interested in book plates and signed copies, they can email her directly to receive those at justin@overdoselifeline.org. Again, justin@overdoselifeline.org. We wanted to, oh, please go ahead, Maya.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I would be happy to individually sign them for everybody and send them back.
Thank you so much, very generous. Well, I would be remiss not to mention a Ms. Sherry Forrest, who has been typing in the comments. Sherry is a mom and an addict, and she has been sharing her personal story via the question pane to all audience members. And I just want to share a couple of key insights from her. Sherry says, "You are a huge voice, Maya, for those who no one cares to listen to. I cannot thank you enough for giving voice to those." And specifically, it shouldn't matter what profession you are in, an addict is an addict, and all should be able to receive the same sort of mental health. No books or degree can educate you on this. This is something that educates you by life experience. Thank you so much, Maya.
Thank you. And yeah, one of the things that most surprised me after the book came out was the impact that it had on parents, because that wasn't necessarily the audience. I wasn't like not aiming it at parents, but it was just been really moving to me that like parents have found that they understand their addicted loved one better. And that is priceless to me, to be able to help that, because I think sometimes parents have been told so many negative things about people with addiction that, you know, that really sinks in, and then they can see the positive parts of their loved ones again. So it's been very cool to see.
Lots of warm responses coming in, just thanking you for your time, your research, and overall this revolutionary new way of thinking about addiction. I apologize if we were not able to individually call out every single attendee question and or attendee comment, but we thank everyone for their continuous engagement. If there are any additional questions, please share them in the question pane. We have many more, again, warm wishes and thank yous to you, Maya, for sharing your story so openly. A wonderful presentation and excellent research and resources. So many have already downloaded their resource handout.
Great. No, it's really, you know, I was so nervous when that sound, when they, you know, whatever crashed. So it's good to hear that it actually did come across well. And yeah, I guess I just want to add too that, like, I think it's so important for people to consider language and consider things like the distinction between addiction and dependence, because if we want to support people who are taking medication for their recovery, if we see them as simply being still addicted or replacing one drug with another or any of those things, we're going to diminish the real accomplishments of their recovery, and we might make them take a decision to come off medication prematurely, which could be deadly. So I'm hoping that families and people support all of these aspects of harm reduction, such as medication and syringe exchange and naloxone. It's really, it's been kind of amazing for me to see, you know, how like this guy I knew was the guy who like first started handing out naloxone, this Chicago man named Dan Big, and now, you know, it's kind of everywhere. It's really good to see. And I think one of the amazing things about naloxone is that you see somebody come back to life. And also, if you're a person who is still in active addiction and you save somebody, that is also a really powerful experience, and one that can help you feel more valuable. And help your own progress and recovery. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much, Maya. There is a question coming in that specific to your experiences within multiple fields, and curious if you have experience within the corrections field, and if you can give a little bit more background on what corrections roles could play within, new roles corrections officers can play within the subject matter you've discussed today.
Sure. So, I think the main one is obviously treating people with dignity and respect as much as possible, but also making sure that their needs for psychiatric and addiction medication are met humanely and compassionately. I know within corrections, there's a lot of concern about diversion of things like buprenorphine. But the thing is, if you actually provided all the people who needed it with it, there would be little market for diversion. So it is important to kind of think of it in context, and that sometimes things we do, like for good reasons, we don't want like it to be diverted, can end up actually causing the problem we're trying to fix, right? So I think that's one important thing, and really just trying to bring humanity and connection to people as much as possible. I mean, obviously, I'm going to say I'd like to keep people out of the system as much as possible. But if they are in there, and if they, have to be in there, there's a lot we can do to make their lives better. And I think there has been a number of programs within jails and prisons that are actively harmful, that focus on trying to break people down and humiliate them and attack them as part of treatment. So getting rid of those and replacing them with a more learning-based, more compassionate, and more building people up approach would be good. Also, I think really keeping an eye on that transition where people are coming out, and trying to make it as less punitive as possible.
What a fascinating study it would be to look at practices within corrections offices, or excuse me, corrections departments across the country, and where there should be baselines for change. But that would be fascinating research, and one that one of our attendees has posed as a follow-up in consideration of the state of Indiana's practices, and where we can audit and review opportunities for improvement.
Well, I think also one of the things that is important there is European corrections have been doing a lot better than we have for a very long time. If you visit some of the Scandinavian states or the Dutch, they have been doing some really cool things. And I'm sure they have trainings and, cultural exchange kind of things where you can learn, and books and, journal articles, whatever. But those are really good models for a lot of stuff.
Fantastic. We have, again, thank yous and appreciations pouring in. I think we can end with Mary Russell's great question of, after 25 years of drugs and alcohol, how long does it take for your brain to be fully restored?
That is an interesting question, and there really is no one answer to that, because it's going to be incredibly varied individually. But people do come back remarkably quickly. When you get in a stable situation where you have the support for recovery, and you have the nutrition and the housing and things that you need to get your brain healthy again, and the social support, people get better quite fast. Now with alcohol, there can definitely be some nutritional deficiencies in B vitamins that actually alcohol-related brain damage is related to deficiencies in B vitamins caused by the alcohol, not the alcohol directly. So supplementing those is a good thing. But just, in my own experience, I was not addicted for that long, but I used large quantities of things. And it took about 2 years for my mood to get kind of okay. I probably should have been on antidepressants at that point, and I might have gotten okay faster, but that is not what happened. But I do think that, it's, you've deranged a lot of chemicals for a while, and it's going to be an adjustment. But one of the things I found that was like a little surprising about early recovery wasn't all gloom and doom. Like I had some really high highs as well. And so you should, watch for those and enjoy those while they last, and recognize that, yeah, it's going to be tough. You're going to be irritable. A lot of people like to, give themselves a break and eat all the sugar they want or whatever they happen to like. I think you've got to be slightly careful with that. But the point is that like you should do things to enrich the amount of pleasurable activities. Oh, and exercise. Exercise seems like it will be horrible if you haven't done it or if you don't like doing it. But the thing about exercise is it's like the opposite of drugs. So basically you get the like pain and then you get the pleasure. So if you can sort of think about it like that, exercise is enormously good for getting your brain back. It really helps in sort of getting chemicals into the brain that promote cell growth. So any exercise, whatever you happen to like, just do something. And I say this as somebody who like really hated that stuff for a long time and is now like randomly into weightlifting. So find something that gets you and just keep trying things till you do, and don't worry about being a beginner, because everybody's going to suck when they're a beginner, and that is okay.
Really well said, Maya. Thank you so much. I think in the words of our attendee, Diana Hendricks, we'll conclude with this. Diana writes, "Thank you, Maya, for your dedication to advocating for better mental health and addictions policies and programs. We love your spirit." Maia Szalavitz, thank you so much for being our keynote speaker for the Division of Mental Health and Addiction INARMS Symposium. To get Maya's book, Unbroken Brain, A Revolutionary New Way of Understanding Addiction, please contact Justin at overdoselifeline.org for signed book plates and copies. And of course, get additional copies via Amazon or wherever major books are being sold. Thank you so much, Maya. Appreciate your time and wonderful keynote.
Thank you all.